Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. This is the third installation of our public education seminar series. Tonight, we're going to talk about stormwater. The speaker is going to be Alan Messer. He's going to go into great detail in some of the stormwater issues that we've had historically here at the City of Hamilton and some of the steps we're taking to mitigate those problems. With that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Alan. And Alan, you can proceed with your presentation. There you are, sir.
Thank you, Jim. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Alan Messer, and I'm one of the engineers on staff here at the city. And I'm going to go into kind of an overall of what the causes of water in basements tend to be, various causes, and then we'll go into more detail on some of those things that people can do something about, things that the city's working towards helping with. So we cover some of the common causes, and going into more detail, talk about the difference between a sanitary and a storm sewer. I'll explain what inflow and infiltration is, commonly referred to as I&I. Talk about drainage around the house and how that contributes. What to do if you have a wet basement, and then two programs the city's implemented here late in 2016. So that may be some of you said you'd not heard about them in the past, and they are relatively new programs that we have, and those are the sewer lateral check valve program and the inflow and infiltration reduction program. And then if you would save your questions to the end, I'll try to address everything that anybody has after going through the entire presentation. So to start with, the causes of wet basements, and there are many. Cracks in foundations, basement walls, that's something that you could either remedy yourself or hire a professional. There's a number of different contractors that deal with those situations. Improper drainage around the house may be part or all of the problem, certainly would contribute to it. And then groundwater will follow your service lines. So the trenches that our utility lines are laid into are bedded with gravel. That gives the groundwater a place to, essentially a conduit that the groundwater follows, and it'll follow that service line. Could be a water line, a gas line, whatever. Sometimes all the way to your house, and will come in there at the house, or else that will help feed what goes into your foundation drainage. Certainly, loss of power to the sump pumps. Back in 2009, we had significant rains and some power outages across the city, and that's when we had probably the greatest number of water and basement issues here in recent history. Hamilton was fortunate here in this last rain that we had just a handful of water and basements. I don't really know if any of those are necessarily due to backups of the sewer, but there were some. Talking to, watching the news in other parts of the country, there were a lot of water and basements. In fact, my parents been in the same house. They were the original owners for 20 years. They had water in their basement here during this last rain for the first time ever. Sister lives in Louisville. She had water in her basement. My brother lives in Pennsylvania, and he had water in his basement. So it was pretty widespread across the country. Fortunately, that was one that essentially missed Hamilton. Improper sump pump installation can sometimes be a problem. You have a sump pump, but it wasn't installed properly, or it was modified in some way. Sump pump failure or capacity issues. Perhaps the sump pump's not sized to handle all the water that it's receiving, or they just wear out in time. Sometimes gravel will get up into the sump pumps and cause them to fail. Another cause is blockage in either the sewer main or the customer lateral. And the blockage could be caused by a collapse. It could be caused by grease. You never want to put like common grease down the drain. Once it gets to a certain point, it will cool off enough to solidify, and that can cause blockages in customer laterals and the main line. And often roots get into, particularly as pipes age, get some cracks in it, that would give a place for the roots to get in there and can sometimes totally clog the pipe. And then I'll talk about inflow and infiltration, I&I, a little bit more here in a moment as to what that is. And it could be a combination of issues. It could be that you have some blockage. It's not totally blocked, but you've lost some of the capacity of your pipes. And then if you have some of these other things occurring, the water, there's just not enough capacity to get rid of the water. So kind of a background in order to understand what I&I is. I'll go into just some of the basics of what a sanitary and a storm sewer is, how they're different. A lot of people think a sewer is a sewer. In fact, I was surprised to find recently that my wife didn't really understand what the difference is. Something I do every day, and just assumed that most people know, and a lot of people don't. So sanitary sewer systems are designed to convey wastewater and from inside homes and businesses to the treatment plant. The one exception would be sump pumps and foundation drains, which are considered clean water. They do sort of come from inside the home, but those should be directed to the storm sewer system. Storm sewer systems are designed to convey clean water, essentially rainwater, snow melt, or any sort of precipitation, and that goes to the creeks and to the Great Miami River. There's some places here on the east side of town where the soils are more granular. It actually mostly soaks into the ground. Hamilton is lucky in that we have separate sanitary and storm sewer collection systems. Back when the sewers were being built in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, two separate systems were made. And the reason that is that the wastewater needs to be deeper. If you're draining a basement, you need a pipe that's very deep in the road. If you're only catching water from, say, a catch basin, it doesn't need to be that deep, but it needs to be much larger because you're taking a lot of rainwater. So in order to save money at that time, they had separate systems. Now this predates, our storm pipes actually predate treating the water. It used to be that all of this water, sanitary and stormwater, dumped directly into the river. In the 1950s, across the nation, we started building water treatment plants and cleaning that wastewater before it goes in the river. So today, you would certainly not tolerate any direct discharge of sanitary water to our waterways. Ideally, only the wastewater should go into the sanitary, and the same thing with the stormwater. We don't want nasty water going into our storm sewer systems. The little image up there on the left kind of shows you the two separate systems. The one, the toilets and sink facilities, is going to a pipe that goes to the treatment plant. The water that's going on the yard and into the streets is going into a catch basin, which goes into a storm sewer, which is dumping, in that case, looks like directly into a river. Inflow and infiltration, what we're talking about now is what gets into the sanitary sewer system that shouldn't be there. Inflow is water other than the wastewater that enters the sanitary system immediately during a rain event, typically through a direct connection, through improper connections, things that such as downspouts or yard drains or those kind of things that should be going to the storm sewer system, but prior to, say, the 1960s, a lot of times there wasn't a requirement and it was tied into the sanitary system, or just perhaps more recently somebody didn't know better. Those improper connections, like I said, include downspouts. They include foundation drains, yard drains, the holes in sanitary manhole covers. If the road gets covered in water, those holes will take on clean water. And then occasionally there's cross connections between the storm and the sanitary sewers. All of those that we know of have been removed today, but there's legacy there, and occasionally we'll find some even today. Infiltration, on the other hand, is water that soaks into the wastewater system from the ground. So it's groundwater essentially, goes in defects in the system such as cracked pipes, either the main line or the customer's lateral, deteriorated manholes, connections, separated joints. A big contributor is broken house laterals and cracks in the laterals. So why do we not want I&I, the inflow and the infiltration? It costs a lot to treat that water that doesn't need to be treated. The wastewater equipment gets used more and wears out quicker. There's a cost for whatever chemicals are used to treat that water. Larger pipes are needed as a result than would otherwise be needed because you're taking excess water. And probably of most interest to those here in this room, during a storm, the improper connections can quickly transport stormwater to the sanitary sewers. You see in the image there, if the water in the sewer system gets above a basement level, it's going to back up, and you can back up into the customer laterals and then ultimately into the basements. Drainage around the house may or may not be the sole cause, but it certainly can contribute to it. I spent my entire weekend redoing the piping around my house. My downspouts went to some piping. My house about 20 years old. You would assume newer construction. All was good, but some of it had cracked. Some of it from the start, as I dug it up, was not properly connected, and some of it, unfortunately, was sloped back towards the house, so the hole that was near the house was where it was leaking into the ground. So I ended up very sore today from this weekend's activities. So groundwater should slope, and the ground itself should slope about 10 feet in all directions. You don't want stuff sloped back towards the house. Some of the people that we've visited, essentially they had the water flowing up against the house, and it just flowed up against the foundation, went down the foundation walls, and then goes directly into their foundation drainage. You really don't want any standing water within 10 feet of the house, and you don't want any that lasts more than 2 days anywhere in your yard, because you can then start having issues with mosquitoes. So you want to maintain your drains, gutters, downspouts, sumps, sump lines in good condition. And if you have a ditch through your yard, make sure you keep that clear of obstruction. Sometimes people don't realize that how much water that ditch carries. They'll plant a tree, put a shed or something like that, or just extend a patio or something to that effect that it blocks that drainage path and then creates problems either for themselves or someone around them. Your downspout and sump line should discharge at least 10 feet away from your house. I know it's difficult in some of the smaller lots, and I'll go into a little more detail on how and where those lines should discharge here in a moment. And then as you are making improvements, say you find some issue, just please make sure that you don't redirect the water that just shifts the problem to somewhere else, creates a nuisance either for the neighbor, the surrounding properties, or into the road right-of-way. Kind of some guidance as far as where the downspouts and sump line piping should go. By city ordinance, those are not allowed to connect into the sanitary sewer. Like spoke about earlier, those would be considered clean water connections, and it can't create a nuisance. Kind of created a priority list for ideally where that water should go. The ideal situation is to put it onto the ground if you live in an area where the ground will actually soak it in. In Hamilton, that would be primarily the east side. We've got more granular soils on this side of the river than we do on the west side. The west is primarily clay and would not soak it in. Even if you live on the east side, you want that to be 10 feet away from the building and 20 feet away from adjoining properties if possible. You can't dump it. In fact, it's prohibited to dump, say, a sump line onto the sidewalk, drive aprons, or towards another structure. If you're not able to soak it in the ground, let's say you live in an area that's mainly clay and it's just going to sit there or wash off, the next best option would be to a downspout or sump line collector. Newer design in Hamilton, we require sump lines along the back of curb. It's an 8-inch line that everybody is permitted to tie their sump lines into. Most of the town predates that design requirement. Catch basins, curb inlets are a good spot if they're nearby. We do allow the pipe to be connected directly into the storm pipes. We try to limit that to one connection per lot, just because every connection that you have is an opportunity for something to essentially break in the future. You can put it to the nearest open drainage course if you live in kind of a subdivision with bigger lots and you've got open drainage typically in the rear. And then if necessary, we do allow downspouts to cut through the curb. If there's no storm sewer, all of those items 1 through 5, there's no opportunities for that. We do allow that downspout line only to go through the curb. The sump lines can't go through the curb, can't go onto the road right away, because over the winter they'll tend to ice. They continue to flow even though it's frozen outside. In the summer, if they're continuing to flow, they can create algae situations. City approvals are required for any work that's done in the right-of-way and for any connections to a public storm sewer. And we do encourage considering environmentally friendly options, such as rain barrels, dry wells, rain gardens, or reuse of that water. What to do as a property owner. So if you've had water in basements, the first order of business would be to try to determine what the cause is. If you notify the city, we will come out and help you diagnose what's contributing to that. The sooner after the storm, the better. If you're able to take pictures and kind of document that, even better yet, video, so that we can see what was going on at the time. Sometimes it's difficult to describe. You also want to notify your insurance agent, again, as soon after the event as possible. We encourage you to hire a professional for cleanup. There is the opportunity to do it yourself, but there's a lot of risks there. The water itself may be contaminated with sewage. It may appear clear, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no contamination. If you have a significant amount of water, there could be a risk of electrocution. And if it gets up into the gas appliances or tries to float them, there could be a risk that there's a gas leak. If you do it yourself, I'd encourage you to contact the city's health department and ask for some guidance on there, but it's always best to hire a professional. I would encourage everyone to elevate possessions that are stored in their basement, put them up on a shelf. Again, I'm in a newer house, and I've got my important stuff several feet off of the ground. I don't expect any issues, but if I ever have a sump pump failure or something to that effect, I don't want family heirlooms to be what gets wet. And there's really no guarantee. We're talking today about things you can do to essentially reduce the risk. There is no way of guaranteeing that you'll never get water in your basement. There's just simply nothing feasible that combination of yourselves and the city could do unless you're built on a mountaintop or something to that effect. If you have cracks, we talked about cracks and foundations, seal those, correct any drainage issues around the house, install and maintain a sump pump and a backup. I've got a backup myself. I actually bought a backup that has a gel battery, because if you've got a backup and you're relying upon that battery, you've got to constantly add, for most of the backup batteries, distilled water to it. And if you don't keep up with that, a lot of them have alarms that kind of tell you when that water level's gotten low. A lot of times the damage is already done. That battery's not going to be there and not going to function for the period of time that you're hoping. And even with the backup, keep in mind that those maybe have a 4, 6, 8 hour life to them. So if you have a power outage that lasts longer than that, your sump pumps out, your backup's out, you could consider a generator. I'm actually considering that myself. You want to remove any improper sanitary connections. So like I said earlier, it could be a combination of issues. And if you've got clean water connections, that tends to swamp your sewer lateral when you have a rain event. So you want to take care of that situation for a number of reasons. If there's any deficiencies in your sewer lateral, the only way really to know that would be to have a plumber come and camera the line. And then you can also install, and you want to keep up with the maintenance again because it's not maintenance free, backflow prevention device. And that's essentially a check valve. There are some other ones, but we'll talk about that some here a little bit later in the seminar. And then I would encourage everyone that's remotely susceptible to this to purchase not only sewer backup insurance, but also flood insurance. Most typical homeowners policies do not cover those two events. I've talked to some people that have had sewer backup insurance and their policy didn't pay out because a flash flood was issued for the area when their backup occurred. I've heard of other people that there was a flooding and they didn't have the sewer backup insurance, and so the same kind of situation, they were not covered. So I would discuss that with your insurance agent. Every policy, every company is different in the wording. I would ask them as many questions as you need to feel comfortable that what you have is covering the likely scenarios. So what is Hamilton doing to help? It kind of covered what you could do as a homeowner. We will come out if you let us know, either calling into the city or entering a request on our 311, which is our online system. If you go to the city websites in the upper right-hand corner, we'll come out, send someone out, myself, a stormwater technician or one of the Jim's field guys, and help diagnose what's causing the water in the basements. We have an ongoing program. We're going citywide, and we're doing what's smoke testing. Some of you have probably had it already come through your area. The smoke testing essentially we send smoke into the sanitary system. If it comes out somewhere other than a sanitary manhole, that's an indication that there's a clean water connection, something that needs to be investigated further. So for example, if the smoke came out out the gutters, out the downspout line, we would know that downspout's tied into the sanitary system. If it came out a storm catch basin or manhole lid, or even sometimes cracks in the ground. The dye testing is kind of a more in-depth evaluation if we're looking, how and where a drain, for example, is connected into the sanitary system. We actually have dye tablets we drop in there, flush some water through it, and then when we see whatever color that dye was come into the system, we know which pipe it's connected into. Once those are identified, those improper connections will work with the property owners to help remove them, give them some guidance. There are some financial assistance options available that the city has. In recent years, we've expanded our maintenance to include sewer laterals, just what's within the right-of-way. Prior to the last few years, the sewer lateral, meaning the connection between your house and the main sewer line, was the property owner's responsibility. Here recently, the city, if a defect's discovered in that, the city will perform that repair. And then we have the financial assistance that started in late 2016 related to the backflow prevention, which is what we call our check valve program. That's the type of backflow prevention we will cover, and clean water removal, which is the sanitary I&I. In addition to those items, There are a number of sanitary system improvements that the city's looking at. We do modeling for the sanitary and the storm system. Use flow monitors, kind of a picture of one up there. It's a little difficult to see what's going on, but we have a number of those devices that we have contractors that go out and help us capture how much flow is going through those pipes, and that helps us calibrate the models. We've installed a number of watertight covers on the manholes, meaning the sanitary manholes. I said earlier, those holes can take on water if the street's submerged. We do quite a bit of televising the sewers, primarily the sanitary, to identify deficiencies. And we're looking at some new technology that actually sends, I think, a sonar, sound wave or something through it that will tell you if it's in good condition, and then you can quickly assess the pipes and move on to those that truly need to be televised or need to be cleaned. It's kind of a time-saving measure that we're evaluating now. We clean the sewers, remove the obstructions, and of course sewer repair, replacement, lining. Lining is where you basically send a plastic lining through the pipes if they're cracked. It's much more economical than installing new pipes. We rehab the manholes, various methods of how we do that, and if it can't be rehabbed, we replace it. And then there's a number of capital improvements related to sanitary. Now, the sanitary lateral check valve program, this is a new program, started December, I think, of 2016, after we had some very heavy rains here in the last 2 years. We had 2 very heavy rains in 2016. We had one in 2017, another moderately heavy. And we have seen Hamilton has, actually the entire basin, the Great Miami River, we received some kind of like a yearly update from MCD that controls the riverways, and they saw actually a 20% increase last year in 2017 over the normal precipitation for that basin. And it's actually a trend they've seen. For the first, they tracked the precipitation amounts from 1945 to like 1995. It was fairly steady. Since 1995, it's been a gradual, steady increase, and based on what we saw here this February, I don't know that 2018 is looking to reverse that trend. But the check valve program is designed to prevent, or at least reduce, the occurrence of a sanitary sewer backup into the house. It won't do anything for your other issues, but if that appears to be the issue, then it is one thing that can help significantly. The check valves are mechanical devices. They are prone to failure like any other mechanical device, and they do have some maintenance. You need to check them every so often and make sure that there's not something blocking the way. Because basically it's just, you can see there in the lower right-hand corner, it's a flap, and if the water tries to back up, that flap closes and can't go. But then when your water comes in, it goes, it floats the other way. So if you have some obstruction there, it will help, but there's still water that's going to get by. Right now, the city offers up to $2,500 financial assistance if you look to have a check valve installed. The installation is typically in your basement floor. It's done by an approved plumber on behalf of the property owner. The city inspects it, and then you're reimbursed for that. I'll go into more of the details of that here. Kind of how the process works. The property owner would submit an application, kind of tell us what happened so that we can basically determine if there's eligibility for the program, and also if the check valve's actually going to help you. Once it's approved and found that it qualifies, there's an agreement that the property owner enters into with the city. That agreement essentially says that you're accepting financial assistance from the city, and that once it's installed, that check valve or further on here, sump pumps. If you get some assistance towards that, that is yours to maintain and replace in the future when it goes bad. Property owner would select a plumber from an approved list. It's a pretty lengthy, I forget how many pages, like 14 pages or something of approved plumbers, and those are basically licensed plumbers that have a bond here at the city. We would provide that list to you. The plumber gets his own permit, schedules the inspection with the property owner and with the city. And then as the plumber's installing the check valves, if they determine that there's a clean water connection or other sanitary or other sewer lateral issue that needs to be taken care of, in the case of the clean water connection, they would come back to the city, or you as a property owner would submit a different application for that financial assistance. The sewer lateral maintenance, if it's in the right-of-way, the city would make that repair. If it's outside the right-of-way on your property, you would be responsible as a property owner. And then the property owner, once it's installed, is responsible for that ongoing maintenance of both of those, as well as replacement. The application, I have some there at the door. If there's some people that are here tonight that have had this issue, haven't yet applied for the check valve program, what it'll ask is the date or dates when the issues occurred, how the water entered, an estimate of the depth as best you can, just a visual. Was the water clear or dirty? Again, just because it's clear may not mean it's clean, but it gives us some indication of, is it groundwater that's contributing, or inflow, or is it actual backup of the main line itself? Photographs and videos, very helpful. We'll ask you if you've already got a sump pump. Of those that we've installed so far, roughly 15% already had sump pumps. They'd already tried to do some things, and then we ended up installing the check valve as an additional help. And then sometimes we'll have to conduct dye tests. Some of the older parts of town, there's not records as to where your particular property drains. You might be on a corner. It's undetermined which street it goes to. Sometimes even if you're not on the corner, they go surprising places, and sometimes we have to dye test those to try to figure that out so that they can put the check valve in the proper location. This is a map of where we've installed check valves so far with this program. You can see they're all to date on the west side, at least those that have gone all the way through the program. And they're fairly spread out. There's some concentration. There's a number in Highland Park, Ross Avenue. There's not so far any common theme that we can say, oh, what if we just replace this pipe? It's spread out enough that the best course of action right now appears to be installing the backflow prevention. To date, we've done roughly 70. We've had financial assistance towards 70. There may be more out there that people did prior to now on their own, but those are the ones that we have documented. If I&I is discovered, we do have a program that offers financial assistance there as well, and that's designed to remove that clean water connection. It also helps to reduce the sanitary backups in the home. So if you put in a check valve, it will prevent water from backing up into your house. But if you've got, say, your foundation drains tied into it, and it's raining outside, the sewer tries to back up, the check valve will shut, but that means that nothing's getting out either. So you might have water from your own foundations filling your basement. Another thing to keep in mind, if you have a check valve installed, you don't have much opportunity to use the appliances inside the house while that thing is shut. Now, it's usually a short-lived event when the sanitary sewer is surcharged. But again, if you were running a lot of water during that time and that valve is shut, it has nowhere to go. Property owners can apply for assistance, and basically what it's doing is removing, let's say somebody already had a sump pump and that sump pump was connected into the sanitary lateral. We remove that connection, one of the worst things to have your downspout connected into the sanitary system. That can really send a lot of water quickly to your lateral, ultimately to your basement, contributes to problems on downstream for everyone else. Foundation drains, I didn't really cover what a foundation drain is, but essentially that's a drain that runs underneath either the perimeter of the base of your house or maybe under your floor slab. It collects groundwater to get that water out, otherwise it would eventually seep through the walls. Keeps it dry. And then exterior drain connections. Frequently, houses that have the driveways that slope down to a garage that's beneath the house, they'll have a drain at the bottom of that driveway. Because it's so deep, it's not easy for those to connect into the storm sewers, and they're often connected in the sanitary sewer. Same thing with stairwells down to a basement. Sometimes we see drains there that are improperly connected. With that, I'll kind of summarize what we talked about and then open it up to questions. Hopefully that helped everyone understand what causes wet basements, actions that you can take to help reduce the risk, and that if you need assistance, if you haven't received any already, and you or someone you know could benefit from this program, either of them, call the city at 785-7550, or again, the 311 request. And I hope I explained well enough the two programs, but I will open it up to questions regarding the process and the programs themselves.
I have a question.
Yes.
That overview of where you've installed the check valves,
Mm-hmm.
clearly it was in Highland Park District. Was everybody in that area notified that you offered the check valve program? And apparently my mom didn't know this because basically flooded in 2016, like everywhere else, Main Street and everybody else. After that point in time, I take care of my mom, and I never see anything notification from City Council. She doesn't have a computer. She wasn't notified that you guys offered this program. Their check valves was being installed, the financial aid, or the sump pump being installed. Her water comes from her main basement drain, not her basement walls. It was 7 inches deep in her basement when I went down there. And when the city guy came out, it was very nice, the city council, he said it was clear water. It was just all the excess rainwater coming through the sewers. And she lives on the corner of Haven and Serial, so she gets the blunt of it, and it just downflows down to the rest of the residents.
Okay, so the
question was,
was it publicized?
yes.
And to date, there hasn't been a lot of publicization of it. We were essentially working through the backlog of applications that we had. We had plumbers putting these into last December. We have plumbers that are still out there today installing these. Oddly, there was not a great deal of interest from plumbers in this program. 2,500 sounds like a lot. Sounds like you could get a lot done. Most of them were completed for 2,500 or less. Even at that, some properties had to put out a few hundred of their own. But just simply getting through what we already had on the books was the order of business. We have talked some about publicizing this more, bringing more people into it. And you're right, you can kind of see what the target areas would be. There wouldn't be a great need to send letters, say, to the east side because there's been so few reports over there because the soils there are able to take on the water and you don't get all that into the system. Jim?
Just to kind of clarify your question a little bit, and so you kind of understand the timeline of thing. Alan, you took over the program in what time frame was that? Was that last summer?
It was last summer. Do you remember
Last
the
summer?
transition like?
It was
Yeah, sometime around, I thought it was
July, August of 2017. And the initial onslaught, and Mike Gurr, if you don't come up for a second so that, Mike Gurr is my field superintendent, and initially under the leadership of the utilities director at that time, who has since left the city, Mike was tasked with the initial work of kind of pulling together this program. And then in last summer, we handed this off to the engineering team, which is under Rich Engel and, of course, now the leadership of Alan. So, Mike, if you don't mind, if you can kind of talk to that 2016 timeframe to kind of help preface some of the things that you just mentioned.
Sure. So 2016 was a very busy year from a rain event standpoint. We had our first rain event was early June timeframe, and prior to that, the last time the city had a torrential amount of rain like that, I believe, was roughly the 2011 timeframe, even before that. So it was something that the city was made aware of by several folks that had attended city council and was looking for some action. While we were investigating that from the June 2016 timeframe and meeting with the individual homeowners or property owners that had received substantial amounts of water in their basements or sanitary in their basement, September rolled along. And we actually, within about a 48-hour period, got hit on September 8th, and then again on September 9th, going through into the September 10th timeframe. So following that, it was very apparent that we had to make some quick actions. So we obviously got together and met with several folks internally, and we had to go to work from a legal standpoint to figure out how we could utilize city funds to help assist property owners here within the city. So we had to go through and make some adjustments with the ordinances. And so that was the biggest challenge, that we had to just get some of that groundwork laid. And then while we were doing that, and we were able to get some of that work remedied, then we started meeting with individual property owners. We actually conducted town hall meetings. We tried to get the word out through various channels, and meeting with various property owners, giving them applications, getting them the documentation, and all of the legal agreements, and then starting that process. And then Alan had alluded to, then we had to start working with the plumbers that are listed with the city to try to come up with a list of plumbers that would be interested in working, so that we just didn't kind of open Pandora's box and letting property owners struggle with, the plumber situation. So we found some plumbers that were interested. We worked through that process, and then we started getting the property owners and the plumbers and all of that such, worked up a scope of work that the plumbers had to follow. We had to go through and get some of the permit costs waived, which required some action with city council on that. And we were able to get through that. And then, as Alan had said, we have roughly about 70 of them completed from the time we started in 2016. I think we have roughly, 160, 130 applications. Several others that obviously are interested, and honestly, it's just a backlog of the plumbers that are currently in place that want to continue to do this and working through their workload with the property owners and their availability. So, and happy to answer any questions as we were progressing through that early transition standpoint before everything was transitioned over to Alan and his team.
How far backlog are you right
now? That would be a great question for Alan, if you want to take
with
that.
the applications and everything?
So the backlog isn't so much the city as it is plumbers who are interested in doing this. We can turn around an application. I know you said yours was submitted, and it sounds like perhaps got misplaced. We'll look into that. But typically we can turn around getting an application signed off on and executed within a couple weeks. Once that's done, we send you a packet, and tell you what you do next. Kind of lists out all the steps of the program. You take that to a plumber. Doesn't have to be those that have been frequenting the program. It could be any plumber that's on the approved list. And then they can start the work. And then it's a matter of getting it scheduled with the plumber. The ones that we've been working with, that we're familiar with here, they don't necessarily have a backlog with City of Hamilton check valve program. They've got a backlog with, they got more work and they know what to do with. So that's kind of where it is. Of those, I think it's like 130 that we have applications. Some of those people chose not to move forward. Some of them were sent their execute agreement back. They haven't moved forward with the plumber. Some of them, we sent them the application. They didn't send it back into us signed. Some of them contacted us and said, hey, we've considered it and we'll just deal with the situation. It only happened once. We know there's issues. We don't want somebody tearing up our floor. We don't want to deal with the hassle of having a plumber come in and do all this work. A host of reasons. We are pretty much caught up ourselves and are looking at how we get this information, where we post it so it's more readily available, essentially in preparation for the next storm. Most people don't think about the issue until it rains, and then you get inundated with people who would like immediate action, and there's only so many plumbers to go around. A little more background. This isn't totally new. Prior to the 2016, the city did offer $1,000 towards this type of activity. It was a $1,000 match. Today, that $2,500 is just a straight fee, and you would only have out of pocket for the check valves if you exceeded. Typically, that's a situation where somebody's got either a finished basement or bathroom facilities in the basement. They've got something more complex than just a simple check valve or two on the floor drain. As I took over the program from Mike last summer, I looked into, well, what are other cities doing? I had to essentially educate myself. What are we doing? How does that compare? Of the larger cities here in Ohio, medium to large cities, I looked at about 21 or so, and roughly a third of them do any sort of financial assistance. It's a common problem. It's not a Hamilton problem, not a state of Ohio problem. It's a common problem across the country. Different places deal with it in different ways. Of those cities across the state, I only came across two that offered more assistance than Hamilton. Those were two of our largest cities, and they actually both have combined sewer systems. I would assume higher utility rates and all that sort of thing, better equipped to deal with the situation. Yes, is there a question?
When would be a good idea to get a check valve put in, or look into even getting one? Obviously, you had water, but for the most part, I've had a dry basement. One time, though, of getting water would be one time I wouldn't want to get water in there.
Can you repeat his question?
Exactly. The question was, when's the good time to look into this? And I would say now. Right now, we haven't had any heavy rains lately. We've got the time to go out there. Immediately after a rain, there's going to be, who knows how many people contacting us all with the same issue. You may not be a candidate. It may not even benefit you, and that's what we've told some people. Some of those applications we've actually, we've turned them down because it's like, you'd be wasting your time and the city's money by installing it because your problem isn't a backup of the sewer system. We could come, you could take an application or take my card there on the table and contact me tomorrow, and we could get somebody to look at your particular situation, kind of, even if you haven't had it, even if it hasn't come up the drain, you're not interested in or wouldn't benefit from a check valve. We could look at the drains around your yard, where your downspouts are going, that kind of thing, and just point some things out to you like, hey, this would benefit you. There are other questions? Yes?
Why is it the Highland Park seems to be the problem? As far as I know, they haven't had a problem in Lindenwold maybe some other areas. Why is Highland Park the one that has all the problems? Because the only reason you have sewer backup is if you had infiltration from stormwater. Because sanitary is not, it's gonna carry the same amount of sanitaries only. So it has to be an infiltration problem. So why is Highland Park the one having that problem?
So the question is, why is the problem concentrated in Highland Park in comparison to Lindenwald, where there's virtually no reports of wet basements? And it's not strictly Highland Park. That's one of the most concentrated areas. Again, there's Ross Avenue has a number of them. There's a few other smaller concentrations, but it's basically a matter of the land itself. Highland Park, if you look, I didn't bring a soils map, but if you looked at a soils map, Highland Park is very poorly draining soils. Lindenwald is very, very well drained soils. It's also a function of where those basements are. The Highland Park properties were all built in the same time period, essentially. The common house types of the time perhaps put a basement lower in relation to the road than they did in earlier years and in later years. So if that basement is low in relation to that sanitary sewer, the other sewers may be surcharging as well, but they're not causing any problems as a result. So it's a couple different things. Hopefully that answers.
Like I said, it has the infiltration.
There probably is a lot of infiltration. There's a lot of
There's
inflow.
no reason for it to be inundated like that. One, well, groundwater infiltrating.
And we have found a lot of those in Highland Park have needed sump pumps. Roughly half of those check valves we put in had improper connections. So it was a combination of issues. My suspicion in Highland Park would be not so much infiltration because of the clay soils, but you could call it infiltration or inflow. The water that goes up against the house goes down the foundation wall, and then if you've got a foundation drain that's tied into those sanitary systems through there, that's going to get into the system. And when you see the most problem typically is when you have a heavy rain that's immediately following a very dry period. Because the clay soils, as they're dry, they'll tend to shrink and pull away from that foundation wall. As you see, the ground gets dry, gets all cracked up. There's cracks between the dirt and the foundation wall. And then when that rain hits, it's got an easy path right down that foundation wall and into those foundation drains. And we've had similar rains that followed a relatively wet period and have not had as much problems because of that. It's just ease of the water getting to the system.
So you're saying the foundation drains are hooked into the sanitary?
That's correct. We found quite a few of those. And those are difficult to find with the smoke test because there's nowhere for the smoke to come out. So you really don't know it's there until you're running a camera through. And often the only time you're running a camera through is if you have a problem or you're looking to install a check valve.
I was actually just going to mention that. So as part of the check valve program, when a plumber has been approved as one of the requirements on the scope of work, one of the very first things is not only to look at the property to see if there's anything on the exterior of the property that would indicate, but also the plumber's required to CCTV or run a camera through the actual sanitary all the way out to the lateral to see if there's any blockages, see if there's tree roots, and also to identify and see if there's any clean water connections. And then, as Alan had mentioned, in Highland Park, we have found several properties that have been identified as having clean water connections and that have been candidates for installing a sump pump to get that clean water connection removed and then get that clean water out.
So you're hooking up a sump pump to the outside footer drain?
No, the footer drains are collecting the water.
Okay.
And so essentially what they're doing is they're installing a sump pump and intercepting those footer drains, and it's collecting that water, and then they're tying in a piping system to go out to the exterior of the building itself, outside, and tie into the storm system. So So getting the water away from the property, that would be rainwater or groundwater, okay? Getting it outside the building and putting it into the storm system so that it does not, no longer go into the sanitary system. And several,
I know when my mom's house was built in 1940, that was the plot plans for her house. So that might be part of her problem, I don't know, but like I said, I had a plumber go through the drainage all the way through the street, no blockage, no nothing, and water came up through that.
one of the challenges, and this is kind of why we've also found it being difficult with some of the plumbers as far as wanting to do this work, is because it does require the camera technology. Not all the plumbers have this, and so they either have to rent it or they have to purchase it, which is very expensive. So hopefully that answers your question.
On Highland Park area instead of Random Hills area where I live. The last time we had the water, the fire department had to come in and rescue the individual out of the vehicle where she was trapped. This is the second time I've got water in my basement. First, now, above my knees in my basement, in my finished family room, above my knees both times. But to the house, one house north of me, 8 foot in his basement. Up to this, he also had a finished basement, 8 foot of water. And to me, you guys are dragging your feet. You promised me that you'd be buying that property from Bessington, buy that, build that retaining pond, a pool, or whatever you call it. And it looks like to me like you're just dragging your feet. You ain't doing nothing. Help me out.
So the kind of the question was, the focus seems to be Highland Park and these check valves and people who are getting water in their basements from the sewer backing up. And meanwhile, in Random Hills, there's people getting water in their basements. In those cases, it's coming in basically windows, doors around the house. It's a different issue, but also a very important one, and it's surface water there. We've got storm pipes that aren't properly conveying that water around those houses. It's going down the streets, in some cases into the house. And I think yourself and your neighbor came in the windows, and there's no way a sump pump can keep up with water that's coming in at that rate that comes in a window well. And you're right, and that's something that is being worked on. Yes?
Well, I may have one of the oldest houses in this room. My house is built in the 1880s, and there actually isn't a slope around it. It's rather flat, and when it rains, sometimes water collects near the foundation, and also sometimes the gutters often can't handle all the rainwater, and it comes down like Niagara Falls. So I collect the water in the trash barrels, and then I use that water plants. I've actually had the house for about a year, and that's not a long-term solution. You know, there's something else. There's a long-term solution I need to do. I have put hoses on the downspouts, but I do plan on, one thing I plan on is rain barrels. I remember you mentioned that. Often the downpours, you have to collect the barrels don't collect all the water. Well, one place where I get water in my basement is where it goes through a coal chute. There's a coal chute with the opening on the ground, and right next to it is a downspout. And I don't know why they put a downspout right next to the coal chute, but I found putting a hose on the downspout, directing it to the sidewalk helps. So there's also in the back there's a cistern that's about 8 feet deep, and some of the downspouts drain through the cistern, but I never seen water in the cistern. I don't think the cistern holds water, and it probably hasn't been used in about 100 years. But I may look into possibly using the cistern to collect rainwater, but is that something you would recommend, or you think that's feasible?
We certainly encourage the reuse of the rainwater. Directing it to the cistern, it's hard to say. Depends on where that cistern sits in relation to your foundation. If the cistern was built 100 years ago and it's no longer watertight, you might fill it with rainwater and find that rainwater migrating over into your foundation. So, I mean, it's it's a risk you'd be taking by doing so. Some of your other drainage problems, if you'd like, you could contact me and we could have someone come out and just kind of give you some tips for some things that might help it. We're certainly happy to help and offer any advice. We see enough of these that, we have some ideas. It doesn't sound like on the surface that you're having the water in basement as a result of any surcharges. We have had I went through and looked at, or asked one of our other staff to go through and look at the at the date the houses were built for those that we've installed check valves so far. And we did have one built all the way back in 1887. The vast majority of them were kind of the Highland Park vintage, 1910 to 1950. That's where we see, for whatever reason, it may have been just where they were building at the time that they were building on those clay soils in some of the lower lying areas. May have been the particular design that was popular at the time, but that's where we most frequently see the issues. So if you go ahead.
It's not a place, I'd say it's probably not a place very well drained, but the fact that during heavy rain and often I see a large puddle collected in the street, but it hasn't come to my house. Mine is a little bit higher than that, but just around the house, it's not a lot of good drainage. But I don't get much water in my basement, usually no more than a half an inch, although I have gone up to an inch on a really heavy downpour. But the water goes away after about a day. I think it probably seeps into the ground because it's likely had a dirt floor one time and they put a coat of concrete over it. But it's probably something I need to correct. I don't think I don't want to ignore that for too long.
No, you want to get the water away no matter what the situation is. You might be able to soak yours into the ground. We can look at soil maps that'll give us a general idea. It's not a guarantee. If it's been packed down or covered over with something, it might have good underlying soils. But if you've got 4 foot of fill between you and what's going to soak it in, it's not going to soak in for you unless you penetrate that layer. Yes?
I got a question, because has the city come up with a plan on new plats for subdivisions that allows proper drainage for those subdivisions to keep what's happening in Random Hills from occurring in new areas?
The question is, what does the city do today to prevent the drainage issues that the gentleman here was mentioning in Random Hills? And we have a rigorous design review for any new subdivisions. We haven't had many here in recent, but we are starting to see a pickup in the residential interest, and we review those. The way the design works, without getting into too much detail, is that essentially it's not supposed to send water off any faster after the subdivision's built than it did before the subdivision's built. There's each of the pipes within that roadway, each of the public storm sewer pipes is sized by the developer's engineer and then reviewed by the city. The overall development, there's often what you see is some of the earlier talks that I gave talked about what a stormwater retention or detention is. Detention is basically a dry stormwater basin. A retention is a wet one. And what that does is it gives the water a place to fill up and then release very slowly over a 1 to 2 day period, so that you don't get all that water rushing off quickly downhill from it. And that's actually what's being looked at for Random Hills. To the north of it is 2 of those to, again, slow down the water. In this case, to remedy an existing situation. In the case of a new subdivision, it would be built to make sure that the new development doesn't cause a downstream problem.
I was talking about, a new development that may be adjacent to an old development where the gentleman lives.
Yes.
To keep that problem from
making the problem, they already have worse. Okay, and then they, like I said, another wall area, and that's, I don't know, I guess you have a hydrologist and everything working to make sure that that's.
We have the modeling itself. The design is performed by the developer's engineer, and it's reviewed by the city. Typically, if it's stormwater review, that would be performed by me, and somebody else would review different aspects of that development. Some of the things we look for is, as I talked earlier, that we don't, that you shouldn't divert your water somewhere where it's not currently going. The same thing, it's a big problem if a large developer does that. So we look at that they don't redirect that water and that they're not increasing the flow of that water after the development's built. So the short answer is yes. Yes.
I got a couple of things. Tonight is the very first night I've heard about the valve check program or the $1,200 match. I don't know who's in charge of the communications to the public, but I think maybe they need to be viewed, because the communications that we're getting, across, I'm getting anyway, my wife's getting, is very poor, extremely poor. And for a city this size, you think the communication would be better. Now, we read the journal news every day, and maybe you had it in there, maybe that small, maybe by a front page or something.
So I think the question is the way in which we advertise these. Right now, this one was primarily advertised through digital media. I think you maybe saw the Facebook posting. We advertised it there. I think the suggestion is that we use the paper as well, and that's something that certainly we'll take back from this and look into doing.
But the thing is, though, a lot of people not on Facebook. I believe this lady back here said, Pomodoro don't have no computers, nothing else. There has to be some kind of better communication to the public than what's going on right now.
Okay, so that's
Put an answer in the utility bill.
are there any questions, or if you'd like to speak to any one of the three of us here after the meeting, don't want to hold everybody, listen to kind of let's turn it more into discussion than question and answer. So are there any further questions at this time? If not, technical or otherwise.
Now you can avoid my question about communication.
No, I'm gonna address your question, because I totally agree with you, and this is something that we're working through. So I have to apologize for the lack of what I consider to be public communication on not only the public education seminar, but as well as some of the programs that you heard tonight. We are going to get better. I do know back in 2016 this place was packed, so people were aware of it, but those people who weren't affected in 2016 kind of ignored it. So, but you may have been affected after that time frame.
I think it's twice, cost $30,000.
And so therefore, that's why it's prevalent. And I understand that. So
I'll correct myself. It cost my insurance $20,000, me $10,000.
I understand that. And I understand that, believe me. And so we're trying to now address these issues. And so going forward, our goal is to properly communicate and to properly educate the public on what to do and how to do it. So I'm hoping that this helped.
Can you or Mr. Mesto tell me when the property we purchased from Bethany?
That piece, sir, is from as far as what your specific issues are, as far as the purchase of that property you're mentioning, we'll have to get back to you on, because that goes all the way up. And so we've got to talk to some of the executives that are basically in charge of that to kind of figure out where we are. But we can't answer that for you tonight. Okay? Any other questions about anything? We do have the Director of Engineering here, Richard Engel. Did you have anything you'd like to say tonight, sir? Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I know this is a very serious topic. We are doing our best, and I mean this, and I'm looking at this man and this man, as well as all the other men that have supported this project. They've worked their tails off, and we're not done. So we're going to continue to do that until we can get further down the road in solving these problems for you. So thank you for coming tonight, and God bless.